All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome, AIIA members, fellows, and friends. I'm Bryce Wakefield. I'm the CEO of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. And before we begin, let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, traditional owners of the land on which we meet here in Canberra. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to all First Nations peoples joining us here tonight, either in person or online. And of course, I'd like to welcome those of you who are joining online. If you have a question during the course of the event, please pop it into the Q&A at any time. You don't have to wait until the event is finished, or rather until the speaker has finished his remarks. Now, as many of you will know, the AIIA is a member organisation. It's thanks to the support and engagement of our members that we can host evenings like this, bringing leading voices on international affairs into dialogue with you. That same community spirit underpins our upcoming national conference on November 17th, right here in Canberra. For those of you in the room, there's a QR code strategically placed around the room where you can look at what's on with the conference. And I think tomorrow we will begin announcing the very exciting lineup of speakers at the conference. And I'd note that we also have a very, very high level keynote speaker at the gala dinner. And I'm excited to announce that person when that person lets me announce the person. So we have confirmed the person, but we hope to announce it shortly. For the purposes of tonight's discussion, however, I'll note in particular that that our conference will include panels on how Australia is working strategically with what might be called like-minded middle power countries in our region. And that's a theme that resonates closely with our speaker's work. It's therefore a special pleasure to welcome Dr. Thomas Wilkins. Tom is Associate Professor in International Relations at the University of Sydney. He's also one of Australia's most thoughtful analysts of alliance politics and regional security, with extensive experience at leading institutions or working in institutions in Japan. He also works in the United States, and he's a speaker, as I learned today, of, is it 6 European languages, Tom? Formally. Tom's new book is Strategic Minilateralism and the Regional Security Architecture of the Indo-Pacific, which I'm pleased to say I got my review of out today. So if you are a regular subscriber to Australian Outlook, that'll appear in your inboxes on Friday, but you can go to the website today. It's a deeply researched study of a phenomenon that is becoming central to our strategic environment. He examines the rise of minilaterals, such as the Quad, AUKUS, and the trilateral strategic dialogue between Japan, Australia, and the United States. These small, at least in terms of their membership, flexible, targeted partnerships may not look like large multilateral organizations, security organizations like NATO, but they are increasingly the frameworks through which our region, the Indo-Pacific countries, manage security challenges and strategic competition. Indeed, when I speak at conferences, as apparently I'm increasingly invited to do in Europe, I'm struck by the level of interest in the Indo-Pacific, and at the same time by the assumptions that come with it. Many audiences, steeped in NATO, steeped in Europe, imagine multilateralism as the sort of gold standard or ideal model of cooperation. But our region is different. Here, smaller and more adaptive minilaterals have emerged as the key building blocks of security. Tom's book helps explain why that is the case and what these arrangements mean for countries like Australia. We're therefore fortunate to have with him this evening to share his insights. So please welcome to the podium, Tom Wilkins.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Bryce, for that kind introduction. And thanks to the AIIA for the invitation, and thank you in the audience for coming along to hear my talk. So there's it's quite a well, it was a much longer book than I originally intended. It was supposed to be about 100 pages. It ended up as about uh, okay. Okay, so it ended up being about 260 pages, so a full-length book, and this is sort of, in some ways, a sequel to my earlier monograph that looked at different forms of security alignment in what was then the Asia-Pacific. Since then, we've now found ourselves in the Indo-Pacific, and so the title of the region has changed. And basically, both the books are sort of complementary as well as being sequels. And basically, this goes back to looking at regional security architecture, something that I was first initiated in by my good mentor, Bill, sitting at the front here, and gradually started to learn the ropes, US alliance system, multilateral institutions, ASEAN, and so forth. Most of those are covered in the first book. And then this second book looks at these newer minilateral forms of cooperation that we hear so much about today. So what I do in both of the books, actually, they're sort of a mix of an academic work, but also sort of focusing on policy and probably with some lessons or insights that may be useful to policymakers. Do a lot of work with think tanks, as Bryce mentioned, and so some of that is also kind of contained in the books. So the books are basically about frameworks for understanding these things better. We hear a lot of talk, we hear a lot of commentary on these things. Personally, I get very annoyed when I hear a lot of muddled terms like everything is called an alliance when it actually isn't an alliance. So AUKUS is an alliance, but actually, no, it isn't the Quad alliance. No. So, one of my sort of motivators is to try and set the record straight as much as I can do. I can't enforce people's speech patterns, but I can try and get some more sort of deeper analytical precision. So that's my aim in these books. So, as I said, the book turned out to be much more comprehensive than I thought. I took the opportunity not only to shine a spotlight on minilateralism, or what I call strategic minilateralism, and I'll explain the difference later. But I also thought, well, since the time of the Asia Pacific, where the region was dominated by the US hub and spoke system and the ASEAN multilateralism, even those are both kind of transformed in different ways. And now, as we adopted this descriptor, the Indo-Pacific, and we've recast the sort of strategic geography of the region that we live in and how we approach it from a strategic perspective, that it would be worth kind of reinvestigating what the security architecture in the region looks like and making a sort of simple cognitive model for breaking that down. Because that, again, I found both amongst academics, policymakers, certainly the media, you get a lot of sort of confused terms. People use the terms security architecture, security order, strategic order, and no one really knows if they're talking about the same thing. So again, it's about trying to be sort of a little more analytically precise. So I'll run you through sort of a walkthrough through the quite extensive content of the book. I'll just very briefly set the context, and I can come back to what I was saying about the Indo-Pacific being so important. Then I'll give you a model for understanding like the different layers of security architecture and how to kind of perceive these within the regional security environment. Then we'll do the frameworks and the kind of intellectual contribution on strategic minilateralism. And then I'll obviously have to walk through the case studies fairly quickly, given the amount of time available, but we can always come back to them. So with the Quad AUKUS and the perhaps the most potent minilateral that most people have never heard of, the TSD, stands for Trilateral Strategic Dialogue. This goes back a long way, and It's basically Australia, Japan, and the United States, and they used to have something called the Trilateral Strategic Dialogue. Now they cooperate in trilateral ways through different frameworks, but it's basically the same principle. Oh, no. Oh, okay. We're competing with the clicker, are we? Okay. Shall I just say next slide? Okay. All right. So just to set the context of this, so I think those of you in the room all have an interest in international affairs. We know that the contemporary Asia Pacific, or now Indo-Pacific in policy speak, security environment is a kind of a period of flux, of disruption. We have a risen China. China's no longer rising, but has risen. We have a potentially disruptive, unstable United States. We have essentially a contested regional order between competing parties. We have arms buildup like we haven't seen since the end of the Cold War. And we've got, to cap it off, we've got all of these multiple flashpoints in the region, like North Korea, Taiwan Strait, East China Sea, South China Sea, also Kashmir, and some of the more minor ones. So the sort of the premise of the book and its argument is that we need to confront this. Now we've had time to digest it. We need to confront this whole notion of Indo-Pacific that's now become a geo-construct to define the region. Rory Medcalf, one of the key advocates for this concept from the National Security College, defined it as a strategic system, which makes it a very certain type of geoconstruct. The former Asia Pacific was much more about mutual prosperity, multilateralism, connectivity, but now we're talking about strategic competition. So this is the second thing. As soon as you go from Indo-Pacific, then you move to strategic competition. The whole region is now in a strategic contest. And this strategic competition, it's all in the policy documents, US white papers, Australian white papers, is multidimensional. So it's not only sort of military, but it's diplomatic, informational, economic, all kinds of different dimensions to the competition that we're in with our rivals or adversaries. And so these two things, the Indo-Pacific coming along freighted with the idea of strategic competition, led to the rise of minilateralism, but particularly the strategic brand of minilateralism, a more consequential version of small group cooperation. Okay, next slide, please. So let me walk you through or sort of draw you a portrait of what the security architecture in the Indo-Pacific looks like now. Now, there's some similarities to the former Asia-Pacific region, but there's also some differences. This is something that, Bill will tell you, we've grappled with as scholars for many, many years to try and unravel this, and we still don't have the perfect solutions, but we're doing our best to get analytical purchase on this. So, of course, the oldest part of the security architecture in the Indo-Pacific and the former Asia-Pacific is the bilateral US alliance network. We're all familiar with that. That still prevails for now. But there's been no new alliances. There's no new military alliances. The last one was North Korea and China in 1960. So we haven't seen alliances for 85 years. And so what we have now are legacy alliances from the beginning of the Cold War. Instead, at the bilateral level, we've seen countries engage in this new non-alliance form of security cooperation, known as the strategic partnership, a term that sounds meaningless, but actually it's been one of my endeavors to try and bring some, to bring more of a sort of concrete understanding of this. So a strategic partnership, like Russia and China, you'll have heard them speak of their no limits partnership. They do a whole bunch of things that are incredibly important that really start to approach something tantamount to a military alliance. Defense cooperation, intelligence, arms transfers, all kinds of things. And then Australia and Japan is another good example as well. Like Japan is our closest inverted commas ally after the United States, most likely. And that is predicated upon our strategic partnership, where, again, we do all kinds of things, joint military exercises. We're obviously just in the throes of procuring the Japanese Mogami-class frigate and so forth. So this is serious security cooperation. Not quite an alliance, but still a meaningful form of security alignment. So those things have sort of taken the place of any new formal military alliances, these sub-alliance strategic partnerships. So this is a big change from if we were writing 10, 15 years ago. Now, we've still got the multilateral security system that pivots on the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, but I think most commentators would agree that this is kind of in trouble. So, from the heyday of multilateralism in the 90s and sort of 2000s and so forth, we still pay due homage to ASEAN centrality, regional security dialogues, pan-regional security dialogues, but ASEAN is struggling to maintain its relevance. Firstly, it's got problems internally in conflicts within its own membership, which undermines its whole basis as a security community in which to, sort of go out there and stabilize the region. And then you've also got strategic competition between key rival states like the US and China playing out within ASEAN multilateral forums as well. So it's sort of become an arena for strategic competition. So ASEAN is not in the greatest shape ever. I think it's still important. Dialogue's still important, still serves a purpose, but it's sort of on the back foot. So as a result of these different developments, states have started to look at small group minilaterals to fill the gaps. So to fill the gaps between the spokes of the hub and spokes network, and to fill the gaps that where ASEAN is kind of unable to act because it needs multilateral consensus, and maybe there's just an issue that only concerns like 3 or 4 members. They want to step out and just take care of something. So this has basically become a new third and in-between layer in the regional security architecture. So I would identify these 3 layers. The bilateral includes alliances and strategic partnerships, multilaterals of all kinds, and then we've got the minilaterals sitting somewhere in between. Next slide, please, Hebi. So just a good sort of very brief way of visualizing this is on the basis of scale. The largest scale with the most members would be multilateralism. So this would be things like ASEAN, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, but you could go beyond that. You could look at things like Shanghai Cooperation Organization. You can populate that with, a whole alphabet soup of multilaterals, some of which are waxing, some of which are waning. Then at the bottom, you have bilateralism, obviously just 2 states. You've got the US alliances and the strategic partnerships, the most consequential or the strongest examples of strategic partnerships being things like Russia, China, Australia, Japan, but the UK-Japan strategic partnership is also shaping up quite strong as well. So they're at different levels. And then sandwiched in between, you've got minilaterals. So not only things like that we're totally familiar with, like the Quad and AUKUS, but also the one that's very important that you probably haven't heard of. We just call it the TSD, so it's not a mouthful, but the trilateral strategic dialogue between Australia, Japan, and the United States. But you've also got some other minilaterals as well, like there's things like Lancang-Mekong cooperation, and which is sort of China and the Mekong states of Southeast Asia. You have things like Malacca Straits Patrol and so forth as well that would also fill that layer. Next slide, please. So this is where we get to the focal point within that larger model. I'm doing the deep dive on minilateralism and particularly strategic minilateralism. So there have been some interesting kind of pioneering works written on minilateralism itself, but they've tended to confuse different types of minilateralism and lump them in together. So you've got something like the Quad and AUKUS and the Lancang-Mekong cooperation and the Malacca Straits Patrol, and they're really not the same thing, right? They're different, like they should be in different categories. So this is where we get to the idea of strategic minilateralism. So this new trend of minilateralism, people argue about 3 to 6 states. Some people say 9. Everybody's got their own magic number. My magic number is about 3 to 6 states. Possibly could be 7, but I probably wouldn't go above that, or it starts looking like multilateralism. So they cooperate in an institutional format, but there's a big difference I would argue between what are, just for want of a better term, what I might call generic or functional minilaterals, things like the ones I mentioned, the Malacca Straits Patrol, that's Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, and Lancang Mekong Cooperation. So China plus Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, maybe that's it. I can't remember now. So they're normally kind of informal, temporary, issue-specific configurations. And those sort of minilaterals, the generic ones, you don't need to be really kind of close security partners or really close friends to engage in them, because they're sort of pretty much functional and at arm's reach. But that's what's different about the strategic minilaterals. You've got to be a bit more committed to these. You know, there's caveats and all. Concretely, and to give it analytical frameworks. These are more powerful, more consequential, more enduring, and they're often anchored in either military alliances or strategic partnerships. So they've got a lot more gravitas to them. There's a lot more they can do. Their effect upon the system is a lot more consequential than just these sort of sub-regional little activities of the generic minilaterals. Next slide, please, Hebe. So I started to give a more substantive definition to minilateralism, and I define it as an institutional configuration of about 3 to 6 states aligned for the purpose of pursuing competitive strategic advantage across multiple dimensions. So you see how I link it back to the strategic competition. This is what these strategic minilaterals are for, to compete against rivals across one or more of these different dimensions. And each minilateral will be differently weighted, as we'll see in the case studies. And why these are more important and strategic than just your run-of-the-mill generic minilateral is they're organized with strategic intent, and they possess sufficient capabilities to not archive but achieve strategic effects. Like they can influence the balance of power in a way that those smaller ones I mentioned before can't. So at the core of the book is an analytical framework. I'm one of many scholars who are obsessed with analytical frameworks, and these are basically this is basically a kind of a toolkit to help you break down the concept of strategic minilateralism and examples like the Quad, AUKUS, and so forth. So it's basically how to understand how the strategic minilaterals are designed, what their functions are, and whether they'll survive. So in the very kind book review that Bryce did of the book, he said these are diagnostic tools, and I wish I'd thought of that one myself, because it's actually quite good as a diagnostic kit. Yeah, so I'm going to incorporate that later on. So I draw upon, I won't bore you with all the international relations theory. It was a bit of international relations theory, a bit of organizations theory. I didn't just pluck this out of the air, kind of assembled it on the basis of having spent a long time studying security institutions. So first of all, with the design, for strategic minilaterals like AUKUS and the Quad, their foundational premise is the Indo-Pacific. Takes us back to the right at the start. These are Indo-Pacific focused institutions, and they're completely linked to the whole adoption of the Indo-Pacific concept, because don't forget, the Indo-Pacific concept is not universally accepted, right? China hates it, Russia hates it, North Korea hates it, I suppose, and ASEAN is a bit ambivalent about it. So, that is something that defines these strategic minilaterals, that they're all pro-Indo-Pacific. So that's the foundational premise. And then if you cast your mind back to my opening remarks, the operational premise is strategic competition. That's what they're designed to do. And that can occur in many different ways. And then one of the things that I think, that I managed to pull out of the very sort of convoluted and varied debates on minilateralism about organizational structure and so forth, some of which I disagree with, is that they come with a superstructure, which is actually the institutions that are specifically that strategic minilateral, like belong to that only, and then a substructure of a whole set of connective tissue of different relationships and institutions that the members themselves belong to, that kind of lends it extra ballast or lends it extra weight. Beyond, people often say, oh, the Quad has a very, very thin, organizational or institutional profile. Yeah, but look at what these countries are doing outside of the Quad that can be used for the Quad. Then functions, it seems there's some really interesting conversations to be had about how we theorize minilaterals, or I think strategic minilaterals, a bit difficult to theorize minilaterals themselves. And we always talk about balancing, international relations balancing. So hard balancing, balance of power, balance of threat, waltz, walt. And so from the hard balancing perspective, these strategic minilaterals can gear themselves up for deterrence, military technological cooperation, generating coalition or combined capability. From the other side, they could do soft balancing, which is regional order building, regional governance, public goods provision, and they may do some combination of both, or they may be heavily weighted in one or the other, as you'll see. And then lastly, what are the future prospects for these strategic minilaterals? Well, I call this solvency, as in how well they'll stick together, and I compare centrifugal versus centripetal factors that might suggest their disintegration over time or their endurance over time. I also pause for a moment at the end of each of those the chapters to think how these institutions might evolve. Will the Quad become a military alliance? Right? Will there be an Asian NATO? These sort of more speculative things, but I open those up, but I don't dwell on them too much. So let's, armed with that, very brief capsule description of the analytical framework, let's look at some of the case studies findings, and being conscious of time, I may have to jog through these a little bit faster and not be able to do them full justice. So we got the Quad, most familiar, one of perhaps the most familiar ones, Japan, US, Australia, India. So it fits the template very well. It's very emblematic in its design of the Indo-Pacific and strategic competition. It's got a weak and informal superstructure, and its substructure is being built up. It has working groups and so forth. But beyond the working groups, there's some connectivity between the countries, but not so much between the other three countries and India. That's one of its weaknesses. Then functions, it's not really for hard balancing. It's got tremendous latent power. If you add together the comprehensive national power of those four countries, that is very, very serious. That's a very, very powerful configuration. But so far, all it's done in terms of hard balancing is rudimentary efforts towards maritime security and deterrence, a little bit around the Malabar exercise and so forth. So this is more what we might characterize as a soft balancing strategic minilateral. It's strong on order building. It's got a strong strategic narrative, the free and open Indo-Pacific, democracy, rules-based order. It provides public goods. It cooperates on critical emerging technologies. These are things that perhaps fall into the soft balancing or other activities basket. Now, in terms of its solvency, it's pretty informal and low commitment, and it's a bit lowest common denominator, since India is not a US ally and has different threat perceptions from the other country members. And it's also got a bit of an identity crisis. It's very difficult to get an answer exactly what is the Quad for. This is another article that I'm pursuing, is, how can we break that down? But nonetheless, it has become an entrenched feature of the regional security architecture. So I'll leave the assessment just for the sake of time, but we can come back to assessing the Quad. Okay, so the next big one is AUKUS, Australia, UK, US. So again, in terms of design, absolutely connects with the Indo-Pacific premise and the strategic competition premise. I'm doing another article on AUKUS as an instrument of strategic competition. Ostensibly, its institutional, or rather organizational structure. It looks very strong. It's very well mapped out. Pillar 1, Pillar 2, Australian Submarine Agency, all very, very well designed and mapped out. Its superstructure as well, very, very strong. Possibly the three closest allies on the planet, the Anglosphere countries. So, it looks very strong, and that kind of counteracts generic minilaterals, which are seen as very sort of weak and informal and don't have much depth to them. Functions is almost totally in the direction of hard balancing, deterrence, military capability, defense technological cooperation, critical emerging technologies. Soft balancing, almost nothing, but they still put a little bit of window dressing on it and say, oh, free and open Indo-Pacific and upholding democracy is important. And that's why we need nuclear powered submarines. So that's a lopsided case. Now, in terms of its solvency, I'm sure that you might want to discuss this a little bit in terms of its solvency going forward. It has struggled with legitimacy in a way that the Quad hasn't. There's been a lot of blowback from rival countries, but also other near neighbors and so forth against AUKUS. And of course, there's many ways that AUKUS could potentially fail. Apparently, AUKUS is safe now. So after the review, maybe things are looking a little bit more positive. But you have to remember, this is the strongest alignment of three countries, possibly in the world. And so they're not going to let this fall over easily. This is important to all three of them. So I think, that kind of, the deep, cultural, strategic connections of the Anglosphere allies lends it a lot of solvency. All right. Excuse me, sorry. All right, so here's the last one, potentially one of the most potent ones that you haven't heard of, originally called the Trilateral Strategic Dialogue, but let's just call it Australia, Japan, US, or possibly AJ, AGIS. That's something the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney is trying to make stick, but so far it doesn't seem to have gone beyond the Sydney campus. So we'll stick with the TSD because people recognise that from old times. Now, this one was actually designed back in 2001. So this is precedes the whole Indo-Pacific strategic competition premises and narrative. So it conceived on 2001, actually started up in 2002. But since then, it's thoroughly embraced the Indo-Pacific concept as the individual member states have embraced it. And it's fully geared to strategic competition for the same reasons. It has a relatively moderate superstructure, like more than the Quad, but less well designed than AUKUS. Again, it has a very strong substructure because we have, you have the US and Japan, US and Australia as treaty allies, and Japan and Australia as two of the strongest strategic partners. So that is really a rock solid bedrock for the institution itself, the trilateral format. Now, in terms of this is the interesting one because it's got a little more balance to it in terms of its functions. So in terms of hard balancing, it does deterrence, it does combined military exercises, joint missile defense. This is ramping up, but it also does a little bit of soft balancing. It does do a few things that speak to the supporting order building, the free and open Indo-Pacific, so public goods and so forth. Not so much as much emphasis as the Quad, but certainly more than the almost non-existent activities of AUKUS. So the main thing now, actually, and this kind of shows you how far this has come since, those of us that have been studying the TSD for some time now, shows you how far it's come. Because the discussions now in the Track 1.5 dialogues are all about, how can we put the missing pieces of sort of combined command and control and, combined capabilities. How can we fill those seams to make this very robust and effectively? I think I wrote a long time ago that it was sort of almost like a virtual alliance, and I might not use that term now, but certainly that conjures up a little bit what it's like. So now this is perhaps the key deterrent and crisis response capability that is ready to go in the region for Australia and its closest allies. Okay, so I think I'm out of time now. So the points I would just leave you with, I know that was a lot to go through. I said the book is difficult to compress. Done my best, but strategic minilaterals are basically security alignments between like-minded countries. They're often built upon existing alliances and strategic partnerships, and these strategic minilaterals are redefining the regional security architecture. They're very, very much like the sort of a new and potent format to conduct serious security cooperation in such a deteriorating security environment. All of the participants seek to gain strategic advantages of one type or another, whether it's collective, individual, one dimension or another dimension, diplomatic, defense, military, technological, economic. This is why all countries see value in them, even though there's some weak links between India and the other countries in the Quad. India still sees value of gaining competitive advantage through the Quad. And as I kind of emphasized throughout, that the different minilaterals are weighted differently towards various dimensions of strategic competition, and the framework helps to sort of reveal this and order this when we approach these and we say, okay, which one's better at this? Which one is more useful for this? We can understand a bit more what their purposes are and the challenges and prospects that they have going forward. And I think I will leave my remarks there. There's a lot to get through. And thank you for your attention. Thanks.
The microphone seems to be working. Hebe, does it seem to be working on your end? Very good. Okay. Great. Okay, we'll open to the floor for a few questions, but I have a few comments and questions first, and I'm the chair, so you're going to have to wait. So just a few things. You mentioned that, was it your department at the University of Sydney was pushing to call the TST the Aegis?
The US Studies Centre, the think tank based on the Sydney campus.
I would discourage that, and the reason I would discourage that because it's a political thing. When you start to name formations after the groups of countries that belong to it, you often attract other partners who want to join, and AUKUS was very much like that. We had Taroaso, who you will know, the former prime minister and former defense minister, and I think former foreign minister as well, actually, of Japan at our national conference a few years back, and he was talking about AUKUS and why not JAUKUS, right? And leading on from, and you know, I think the AUKUS partners have constructed AUKUS, whether or not you agree with AUKUS, there's kind of a genius about it, in that there's a sort of compartment in Pillar 2 that allows other partners to become, you know, to satiate their political will to join something without actually being part of the core AUKUS minilateral. I'm fascinated by the fact that you're writing an article on the Quad, and I want to see it as soon as possible. So if you could send me an early draft, that would be great, because it's something that I'm often asked about when I go to conferences. And I think, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree with me, that the Quad is essentially there to ensure that India is not floating off, and well, it always will, because it's got a policy of multi-directionality, or whatever you want to call it. But it's to make sure that it's still sort of within our camp on important issues. And the way that I see the analogy that I use, and it's infantile, I know, is that it's kind of like a superhero movie. When you're watching a superhero movie, there's the goal that the superheroes are all teaming up to achieve. But, you know, curing cancer in the Pacific, or finding a vaccine for COVID, but that's not why you're watching it. You're watching it to see whether Batman and Superman can get on. And and that's sort of where I see the Quad as being. And I'd like your response or what you actually see the Quad as. Could you give us a bit of a preview of your article, please?
Yep. Okay, so thanks, Bryce. I shall be sure to pass the message back to the US Studies Center and Mike Green on your behalf that you're not endorsing AJ-US AGIS. Yeah. But, it's something that, certainly we see in other commentaries that pundits like to play with things, like even, can we invite France back to AUKUS and call it FRAUKUS? Because that sounds quite good. So, these things happen. The big problem is it's difficult to put an identifier on that trilateral formation, the US, Japan, Australia. Do we call it the US, Japan, Australia trilateral every time we articulate? It's a bit of a mouthful. And so we just need a quick...
Does it need one? I mean, the thing is, it does its work very quietly and effectively, right?
Indeed, I would agree with that. In fact, that's why no one's ever heard of it, despite the fact that when you start drilling down into this, there's some serious cooperation going on there. When I was based in Japan last year, working on this, my host there, Michishita, yeah, Michi-san, yeah. He suggested that I have a look, like what military exercises do Japan, Australia, and the United States do? What do they do trilaterally? And I started looking at it. I was like, whoa, some serious stuff, actually. And the language that they use to describe these is warfighting practice and things like that. So, this is a very, very potent instrument. And the fact that it goes under the radar is actually perhaps beneficial, not to draw so much attention to it, because, you've seen how other states in the region have have lashed the AUKUS in particular, but also the Quad with criticism. And, TSD seems to just quietly, be the quiet achiever. Anyway, on the Quad, my simple answer is that I think the Quad is one of the strategic minilaterals. I think that's the best way to describe it. I think maybe that's more of a conceptual term than a policy term, the strategic minilateral. But what I'm doing with the article I'm working on at the moment is trying to prove that it's not an alliance, right? Now, most people say, of course it's not an alliance. Like, we know that, right? But it still keeps on struggling with this kind of alliance association. So if it's not an alliance now, then what is it? Okay, I would say it's a strategic minilateral, and then I'll explain to you what a strategic minilateral is. And then what you find very quickly is that the sort of the commentary or the analyses run from what it isn't now, or what it isn't now, to it'll be a military alliance in the future. Could it be one? So John Hemmings has written on this, like the Quad should become a military alliance. So you just can't get away from this kind of alliance association question. And so I'm trying to unpack that. I don't know if it's particularly helpful for policy conversations, but from an academic point of view, I'm trying to get to the bottom of what the Quad isn't, is, and might become in my article. So I'm be happy to have further discussions with you on that. But on the other hand, what you identified was this kind of what I might call, so that issue that I've just described, I would call alliance association. That might also tell us that people that, states don't go in for formal military alliances now, and they see other configurations of alignment, such as the Quad, such as AUKUS, strategic minilaterals, or strategic partnerships, as more appropriate policy tools. So it might tell us something about how the military alliance model is outdated. Right. And then, then the other thing I would say is you've got this kind of alliance tension in the Quad, because I'm pretty sure that the United States, probably Japan, probably Australia as well, would like this to become a bit more of a hard balancing mechanism, but it's limited in how far India will go because of the omni alignment that you just suggested. Don't know if that comprehensively answers your question or just confuses you more, but
that's great. But
but we can follow up on it if you want to go, into the weeds. Yeah,
question, but I better give it.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Make sure, by the way, if you're new here, there's no sound out, but Mike, so please do.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic, Tim. Thank you. And music to my ears. I've just finished 33 years of Australian government service in the diplomatic corps, and I attended the second and third at TSD in Tokyo with Ashton Carlett. It was wonderful to hear your clear-eyed and very sensible description. your toolboxes, your diagnostic tools, whatever you like to call them. It was just great. I agree with you. The terms get terribly muddled. Another term that gets muddled is summit. But anyway, let's not go there. I'm referring to your diagnostic tools. The superstructure and substructure design framework is very, very useful. One thing we always, as practicing diplomats, grapple with is institutionalization. And I think, again, there's a lot of confusion about this, because I now am at the US Study Centre as a non-resident senior fellow.
So you're over there then.
And we have terrific discussions, as you know. But if there are visiting either academics or, former officials from Europe or the United States, particularly, sometimes also many from Japan. But from Europe and the United States, we tend to get this almost reflexive need to find a solution for this group, whatever the group they're talking about. And the TSD is a case in point. The other case in point recently was the IP4 at NATO. Now, I know academics need to look at blue sky thinking and propose ideas for government, and we're extremely grateful for that. But the reflexive position is to find a way to institutionalize in a very, very conventional sense. I would really appreciate your comments on that. That kind of institutionalization, which is ASEAN, the UN, NATO, as you said at the outset, hasn't really developed in our region. Can you explain why, and why that might be a good thing? I personally think it quite a good thing not to institutionalize in that way. And secondly, I'd point to your very prescient comment that when you look at something like the TSD, you've got 3 close partner countries who are mutually reinforcing. So there's a relationship kind of synergy that pushes the group together and keeps it going. It has its own internal combustion, if you like.
Yeah, that's great phrase. Yeah, thanks. Those are terrific comments, and yeah, that's a tricky question to grapple with, though. Actually, I think that on the question of institutionalization, we can come back to NATO IP4 because I've been doing a lot of stuff with that, including with US Studies Centre. So that's probably a good kind of case study. But I think what you've seen with the sort of, should we say, the traditional military alliance model, full military alliance, conventional military alliance, usually good idea to keep the military attached to it because alliance is used in everyday terms as well. But I think that's sort of past its sell-by date, at least in terms of a policy option, like a new policy option. Now, we already have those extant alliances, NATO, of course, that's being revitalized. Several hub and spokes American alliances, some of which are being bolstered, some of which, like Thailand, drifting away. Right? So we still got those, and those probably won't be disestablished. They'll go through a process of institutional adaptation. And indeed, the US alliance system itself is going through a macro process of adaptation, whereby it's investing more or getting closer to certain allies. Japan and Australia, the 2 closest. Korea seems to be coming back. Philippines has come back, right? That, at the time I was writing, those 2 were drifting away, but now they're coming back. So there's that. Then the US is also building strategic partnerships, not alliances, because the recipient states won't have an alliance, a formal military alliance, with Singapore, Vietnam, India, other key states, to build a certain layer of less formal, less binding, and less heavily institutionalized cooperation, as you alluded to. Then you've got the US encouraging its spoke allies, its treaty allies, to build connectivity between one another, connect the spokes, again through strategic partnerships. And then you've got the US, the North Atlantic Alliance, and the hub and spokes allies, and then building connectivity both between those 2 sets of allies, but also between individual allies themselves, which is what I think it was Jake Sullivan called the lattice work model, but there's various other mesh work and so forth. And so I've been studying this a little bit and how this is working. And so what we're now doing is we're working sort of like in a much more three-dimensional institutional web of things. And so, that was prescient to look at it in that way. But I still think as maybe as like individuals, when we're just looking at something, we're looking at it a bit two-dimensionally and saying, okay, where's the hierarchy and how does this fit all the pieces? And, how does this fit on the piece of paper? And we need some kind of like spinning 3D model to, maybe AI will help us like to unpick this. And but I think that things like these strategic minilaterals, like the strategic partnerships that are usually bilateral, because formal alliances are neither necessary nor desirable, and they're potentially provocative, despite the mutual desire to increase security cooperation, that you have these less formal institutional models that are more agile, more flexible, and are designed to work in an environment that is defined by strategic competition rather than like direct sort of military rivalry between blocks, because there's a little bit of a hedging element to them as well that you don't, so Singapore, like, will go as far as a strategic partnership, but wow, we're in military alliance treaty, no. So I think that's an element to it. So I think it's about searching for kind of lighter institutional frameworks that are basically fit for purpose and not being bound by these more rigid models that still persevere under NATO and others, but that in some ways can be impediments because they have to adapt a lot as well. But you absolutely put your finger on what is a very complex question, and I'm spending a lot of my time trying to unpick this, so I'd love to chat with you more, perhaps over back in Sydney. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go to someone else. I have another question. I'm going to bundle it with somebody else's because it was my burning question and you're just touching on it now.
Okay.
And it's the difference between alliances and strategic partnerships. Because if you look at the agreement signed with Japan, right, basically the functional understanding between Australia and Japan, the functional kind of mechanism in there is the necessity to consult if there's some problem, let's say conflict or whatever, attack in the region. And that seems to me to be more or less the same thing textually that exists within the Kansas Alliance and the US-Japan Alliance. So what's the difference, aside from maybe the fact that those two alliances are ratified as a statute? Is there any other difference apart from that? And then I'll give somebody else. I'll give you the chance to think about that while somebody else is also asking another question.
Okay.
Thank you, Thomas, for your exposition and analysis. I mean, my question is really one of, we are not quite sure about the omission. Is it that that country is insignificant? It's not a security risk. It's not important enough. But where does New Zealand fit into all of that?
Okay.
Out of the 3 case studies you provided on strategic minilaterals in the Indo-Pacific, Australia, US, and Japan were in 2 of the 3, with conversations taking place, or people infuriating that Japan could join Pillar 2 of AUKUS. So the first part of the question is, if Japan was to join Pillar 2 of AUKUS, would that make the TSD irrelevant? And the second part is, if nations were to join Pillar 2 of AUKUS, how would that affect the solvency of it as a strategic unilateral?
Okay. Now, those questions require super complicated long answers because I'm doing research on all of them. So I'll try and boil it down. Actually, this is my biggest challenge, is boiling down complex answers to shorter sound bites. So just quickly, Bryce, on alliances versus strategic partnerships. So I think strategic partnerships are non-alliance or sub-alliance forms of serious security cooperation. But I should advertise to you that there's a ferocious debate going on between whether or not strategic partnerships actually are defined by the security cooperation and our security alignments, my camp and my fellow travelers, and those that say strategic partnerships could be based upon any kind of function. They could be based primarily on economics or primarily on cultural ties or something. I'm not persuaded by that, but there's a big sort of kind of debate going on in academia as to like what is the meaning of strategic partnership. I probably, just because of my background and previous publications, would say no, strategic partnerships are a form of security alignment that sit below alliances. They don't have a security guarantee. They again have a range of functional activities. Security seems to be becoming more and more important, I've noticed over time, in Russia, China, Japan, Australia, and others. So that kind of helps my argument. But they also feature economic and cultural ties and everything. Maybe that's kind of ballast to it. But the thing is, you're right to point out that the language used in the recent 2+2 and the revised Joint Declaration on Security Cooperation for Australia, Japan, is definitely starting to move in towards like alliance proximity. And you picked on that, there's that fly in the ointment with ANZUS, isn't it? Because it doesn't guarantee a joint military response or a mutual military response. It talks about consultations, and yet we all assume it's a military alliance like Article 5. Now, again, I've thought about this a lot. There's a lot of things to say about this, but as quickly as I can. Now, it might not be so much what is actually written down. It might be more about what mutual expectations are. And I think the strength of mutual expectations in Washington and Canberra are that, effectively, we decide it's a military alliance until proven otherwise. And obviously, John Howard tried to prove otherwise after the 9/11 attack. So say, oh, you triggered the treaty. It's like, yeah, that's an interesting interpretation, right? So that's a flaw with the alliance model itself. But then, it depends whether we're going to go for the gold standard to define alliance, which is Article 5, and the strategic partnerships don't have an Article 5. But you're right that they do somewhat, in the stronger cases, look more like these, what we assume to be alliances, ANZUS, but we see consultation, not guaranteed mutual military support. If you want a good example to try and prove me to prove me wrong, there's a better example than Australia, Japan. Look at the Russia, North Korea strategic partnership. If you look at the text of that, that's just millimeters away from a military alliance. So you could say maybe these strategic partnerships in a post-alliance world, I know there's legacy alliances, but no new alliances, so a post-alliance world, maybe strategic partnerships are the closest or new manifestation of alliances. And we need to think a little bit more conceptually, but also in practice, about what it means to be in a military alliance or some other alliance without the military prefix. But those are deep, deep questions. Now, on New Zealand, you'd be pleased to know that I've been working on cross-regional security cooperation between NATO and the IP4. New Zealand is one of the IP4 members, so they get a seat at the table. They were the only one in the last NATO summit to send their prime minister. The other three countries, Japan, Australia, and South Korea, did not. So that probably shows that New Zealand values it, or the prime minister had some time on his hands, and that they do see some value in this because they want to have some sort of presence and some sort of effect. But that said, I talked to my Kiwi scholars in track 1.5s. They know they have sort of limited capabilities, but they have some important niche capabilities that are valuable to NATO and IP4 countries. So, they are there, but, in a fairly small presence, but not excluded. Now, again, this is another one that requires a massive group, so, we can always follow up. Now, the first thing I'll just make a couple of points that's sort of appropriate to the larger questions that you asked. So One of the things, and I think that Bryce alluded to this in his book review, is that you sort of see the same states within each of these minilaterals, more or less. There's a big overlap, like Australia. Whoa, minilateral superpower, right? We're in all of them. But then you've got another minilateral, which is potentially or could be on its way to being a strategic minilateral. It's definitely more consequential than a generic minilateral, which is the Global Combat Aircraft Program, which is Japan, UK, and Italy, excludes the United States. So that makes it interesting by itself. It's maybe a little bit of a backup, right? Now that we're sort of seeing some, we have some reservations over the trajectory of the US foreign policy, both at the moment, but possibly into the future. You're seeing partners from different alliance complexes, the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific, members of the NATO IP4, actually building minilaterals between themselves without the US. And I've heard a lot of talk from Europeans and IP4 countries. What can we do together, like sort of just the European membership of NATO plus Canada, even if we're missing the United States? So it sort of gets to that trend. The other thing that you intimated was, could there be a possible, and that was a great observation, is could there be a merger of these minilaterals given the overlap in membership? So I wrote an article for the AJIA recently, where I started to look at the plans that the Americans had, at least under Biden, maybe discontinued, and plans that the Europeans more or less were on the same track, which was, can we build stronger coalitions between like Western allies? And what's the way to do it? So multilateral, NATO IP4, that's great, but it's big. What about minilaterals such as GCAP, AUKUS, and what about either building new minilaterals, probably more unlikely, or what about merging existing ones based upon membership or functional compatibility? So I'd say you're on something with that, but it is pretty blue sky thinking as to how that might be operationalized.
I can't time, so that's it.
Mm-hmm.
I was about to say, join me in thanking Tom for his excellent presentation, but you already have. The book is Strategic Minilateralism and the Regional Security Architecture of the Indo-Pacific, recently reviewed in Australian Outlook. Normally at this point in time, I would give to our speaker a special gift. That gift would be Australia and World Affairs, which of course is the seminal work of Australian foreign policy, published by the Australian Institute of International Affairs every year, every 5 years or so, going back to 1950. Tom Wilkins is one of the authors of Australia and World Affairs, so he does have his own copy. So I have given him a complimentary book from our desk out there. The rest of you, if you want one of those books, you can purchase one off Hebe. But for now, I'd like you to join me in again thanking Tom for what I think has been a very thought-provoking and scintillating and useful. I have to say, you used the word useful, Jane, and I totally agree in terms of figuring out how these constellations fit within our minds and within the broader strategic framework of the Indo-Pacific. This book, Strategic Minilateralism and the Regional Security Architecture of the Indo-Pacific, snappier title, Tom, please. Would have been fantastic. Keyword search. Okay, very good. Okay, so join me in thanking Tom again.